The trade war was supposed to hurt China. Higher tariffs, blocked technology, restricted supply chains, the most aggressive economic pressure campaign one country has ever mounted against another in modern history. It did not work. In 2025, China recorded the largest trade surplus in the history of the global economy, almost $1.2 trillion. In the first quarter of 2026, its exports grew 14% year over year, reaching nearly $1 trillion in just 3 months. Semiconductor exports, the exact category the United States has tried hardest to cripple, surged 111%. And the reason none of this is the lead story on every business channel in the world is because it is enormously inconvenient for almost every government involved. In the next 12 minutes, you are going to understand exactly how China turned the trade war into an advantage, who is paying for that, and why the story being told in most Western headlines is missing the most important half of the picture. To understand why China's position is so extraordinary right now, you have to go back to the original premise of the trade war, because the gap between what it promised and what it delivered is genuinely staggering. The tariffs were sold on 3 promises. Promise 1. American manufacturing would come home, factory jobs would return, entire industries that had migrated to China over 30 years would be rerouted in the United States. Promise 2. China's export machine would be damaged. American tariffs would make Chinese goods uncompetitive. Chinese factories would lose orders. Chinese growth would slow. Promise 3. The trade deficit between the United States and China would shrink. America would stop sending hundreds of billions of dollars a year across the Pacific. In 2026, after the most aggressive tariff escalation in American history, with levies that peaked at 125% on Chinese goods before a partial truce, here is a scorecard. America's manufacturing jobs have not returned. They went to Vietnam, to India, to Mexico, to anywhere except the United States. China's trade surplus is the largest ever recorded, and the US trade deficit with China, despite all the tariffs, remains at over $340 billion. Here's the mechanism that most Western commentary is missing entirely. When the United States raised tariffs on Chinese goods, it did not stop those goods from moving. It simply changed where they moved to first. China's exports to the United States did fall by 16% in the first quarter of 2026. That number gets cited frequently as evidence the tariffs are working. What gets cited far less frequently is what happened everywhere else. Exports to Southeast Asia surged 20%. Exports to Africa surged 32%. Even the European Union, which had introduced its own tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, saw a 21% increase in Chinese imports as Chinese exporters found new product angles and price points that bypassed the EU's specific restrictions. The total output, China's Q1 2026 exports reached $977.6 billion. The United States' share of that total was smaller. The overall total had never been higher. And then there is the Vietnam strategy, which is possibly the most elegant piece of supply chain engineering in modern economic history. Chinese companies, including BYD, better known for making electric cars, set up factories in Vietnam. They import Chinese components into those factories for final assembly. The finished product ships to the United States with the Vietnamese label. BYD's facility in Vietnam exported $5.1 billion worth of products, including iPads for Apple, while importing $4.9 billion in Chinese-made components. The factory added 4.5% of total export value inside Vietnam. The other 95.5% of the value was Chinese. It is not illegal. Tariff rules have always been defined by where final assembly happens, but it means that an enormous portion of what the United States now imports from Vietnam is, in economic substance, Chinese manufacturing with a different passport. Here's the part of this story that should concern the rest of the world far more than the tariff debate itself. China did not just redirect its existing exports, it upgraded them. While the trade war was being fought over cheap t-shirts and furniture, the categories that defined the original China price, China was quietly becoming the dominant manufacturer of the most strategically important products of the 21st century. Semiconductors, electric vehicles, solar panels, lithium-ion batteries, the four industrial categories that will define geopolitical and economic power for the next 50 years. China has built dominant positions in all four while the trade war was underway. BYD's cheapest electric car, the Seagull, retails for less than $8,000 in China. The cheapest American electric vehicles starts at $33,600. Both face the same raw material costs. The gap is manufacturing efficiency, supply chain control, and scale that cannot be replicated by tariffs alone. China's passenger car exports rose 60.6% year-over-year in the first quarter of 2026 alone. China's EV export volumes are now so large that the company had to build its own fleet of vehicle-carrying ships to move them. It commissioned those vessels years ago. The infrastructure to dominate global car markets was being built while Western governments were still debating whether Chinese EVs were a real threat. And then there is the AI angle, which few people are connecting to the trade war history but which is now driving an enormous share of Chinese export strength. The global AI infrastructure build-out, the trillions of dollars being spent on data centers, requires semiconductors, servers, optical modules, and power management systems. A significant portion of that hardware is manufactured or assembled in China. Semiconductor exports from China surged 111% in May 2026. High-tech goods overall surged 50%. Chinese companies like Zhongji Innolight, a manufacturer of the optical modules that sit inside data centers, are seeing windfall revenues from an AI boom that the United States originally believed it controlled. Now, and this is important, declaring China the winner of the trade war is not the same as saying China is thriving, because inside the same economy that is posting record export numbers, there is a domestic crisis that is not getting better. China's retail sales growth hit 0.2% in April 2026, a three-year low. Domestic consumer demand is barely moving. A property crisis that began years ago has never fully resolved. Chinese household wealth, two-thirds of which is tied up in property, is contracting. The jobs market tells an equally uncomfortable story. Despite soaring exports, the number of manufacturing jobs in China is actually contracting because the exports driving growth are in high-tech, automated categories that need fewer workers per unit of output than the labor-intensive manufacturing that built China's middle class. As one HSBC economist put it, despite soaring exports, the number of manufacturing jobs continues to contract as productivity gains from automation reduce demand for workers. China's growth target for 2026 is set at 4.5 to 5%, the lowest target since 1991. Even with record exports, the engine of broad-based domestic growth is not running properly. What China has built is an export machine of extraordinary power and an economy of significant domestic fragility. Those two things coexist. Understanding both simultaneously is the only way to read this situation accurately. The full consequences of China's export surge are not landing in Washington or Beijing. They are landing in places that have nothing to do with the trade war. Economists have a name for what is happening. They call it China Shock 2.0, a reference to the first wave of Chinese manufacturing dominance in the early 2000s that wiped out entire manufacturing sectors in the United States, Europe, and developing countries simultaneously. In the first wave, China competed on price in basic manufacturing. In this second wave, it is competing on price in strategic manufacturing. Electric vehicles, solar panels, batteries, the industries every government on earth has decided it needs to control for its own future. The European Union is watching its car industry being undercut by Chinese EVs that are 40 to 60% cheaper than comparable European models. EU car makers, Volkswagen, Stellantis, Renault are scrambling to cut costs, close plants, and lobby for protection in markets they assume they would dominate. Developing nations face a different version of the same problem. Chinese exports surged 32% into Africa in a single quarter, undercutting local manufacturers across consumer electronics, appliances, and automotive categories that African governments have been trying to build domestic industries around. And there is a structural irony that almost nobody is pointing out. The United States introduced tariffs partly to protect American manufacturers from Chinese competition, but the supply chains those tariffs pushed out of China went to Vietnam, India, and Mexico, countries that are now themselves competing with American manufacturers. The tariffs moved the competition, they didn't remove it. So, what does this actually mean for the global economy and for the people watching this video? The first lesson is about the limits of tariffs as an economic weapon. Tariffs raise costs at borders. They do not build factories, they do not train workers, they do not create supply chains. The manufacturing renaissance that tariffs were supposed to generate in the United States has not materialized because tariffs alone cannot manufacture things that manufacturing requires. The second lesson is about industrial strategy. China's dominance in electric vehicles, batteries, semiconductors, and solar panels did not happen because of some sudden insight. It happened because China made industrial strategy decisions in the 2010s and executed them relentlessly, while other governments were still debating whether those industries mattered. The third lesson is the most uncomfortable. In trade wars, as in most wars, there are rarely clean winners. China's export machine is winning. China's domestic economy is struggling. The United States avoided the specific damage it feared, Chinese goods flooding American markets, but it also did not achieve what it wanted, an American manufacturing renaissance. And the world outside the US China relationship, the manufacturers in Africa, the car workers in Europe, the factories in Southeast Asia now being caught between Chinese supply chains and American tariff pressure, they are paying the largest price of all for a war they had no part in starting. Here is the question that nobody in either Washington or Beijing wants to answer out loud. If tariffs had not reduced the US trade deficit with China, had not brought manufacturing jobs back to America, and had not slowed China's export growth, what exactly is the next move? More tariffs are already on the table. The Trump administration has proposed new levies targeting 60 countries simultaneously under a forced labor investigation that legal experts say has almost no precedent. The escalation playbook is being rerun. But as one China economist put it, Chinese companies are simply much better at controlling costs. They have supply chains from upstream, midstream, to downstream, so it's easier to contain costs at each segment. Tariffs add costs at one border crossing. China's supply chain advantage runs through every stage of production before the goods ever reach that border. That asymmetry, more than any specific policy, any specific tariff, any specific negotiation, is the hidden structure of this trade war. And it is the reason that for all the noise and all the drama and all the headlines, the fundamental numbers have moved very little in the direction anyone in Washington intended. The trade war is not over, and the story being told about it in most headlines is missing the most important data. This is what Unseen Drafts exists to do every single week. If you want to understand what is actually happening beneath the headlines, subscribe now.